if you just met me today, hearing that I'm in a top neurosurgery program in the country at UCSF and that they've said I've been doing the best research in the residency 2 years in a row, you might assume I've always been like this. But in fact, that's not the case. I did not just fall out of a coconut tree like this. So this video is to supply some context about how my father, some great mentors, and supportive research institutions led me to where I am today. Now, on the path to becoming a neurosurgeon and physician scientist, studying how to better understand and find new treatments for neurologic disease. So, hope you like it. Hey folks, I'm going to talk a little bit about my science journey, my journey into being a scientist. The reason why is because I think stories of how people got to where they are or how they've become, whatever type of person can be helpful to folks who are choosing paths. I remember when I was right out of college and trying to figure out what to do, I was always very comforted by hearing other people's interesting paths to XYZ and indirect paths to XYZ. And it was just comforting. It doesn't necessarily help me do whatever I ended up doing, but it can be nice. So I'm going to chat a little bit about my science journey. So my father was actually a scientist, a research scientist, a PhD scientist. And growing up, I would occasionally go into his lab and he would tell me things that I thought were cool, or that he thought were cool. And I just thought it was the most boring thing ever. I thought it was like dingy and just like nothing that was in that lab was interesting to me. So growing up, I was pretty sure I had wanted nothing to do with science because that was my example of what science was. I also had the idea of becoming a doctor implanted early and was very soon like, oh, I definitely don't want to do that. So I had the specific thoughts of whether to be these things and had at a, high schoolish age been like, oh, that's definitely not what I want to do. So that's a little bit of the background, but had some exposure, did some things. Then I have my other story about how I got into neurosurgery. Basically, when I was trying to get into medical school, I all of a sudden saw it as an asset, having research on my resume. And so really, I started working in a research lab while doing my post-bac, taking my pre-med courses to go to med school. And I had a much different experience working in this particular lab. It was like a tumor biology lab, and they did mouse models of forms of cancer. And I was just treating it in a different way because it quite literally was something that I wanted to improve my resume with. And I was very interested in improving my resume. And so I was interested in working hard, and I had fun with it. It wasn't like my favorite thing in the world, but like I had fun with it. And then I started getting some positive feedback. Other people saying, hey, you're doing good work. And all of a sudden that kind of changed everything. And I was like, oh, wait, other people think I'm like good at this thing. I'm interested, right? And so quite literally me being kind of like a sucker for compliments started doing more and more science because I had some good mentors early on who were very supportive and were like, "You're good at this. You know, you should keep pursuing this. I like what you're doing. I like these ideas," and that was really important. Having good mentors who, you know, were really interested in what they're doing and getting positive feedback. It really helps, right? So, I was doing like a lab tech type of job while applying to med school. I get into med school, super excited about this. I go to a research-oriented med school where it's ingrained in the system to do research. And as soon as your first summer after your first year of med school, when I was there, they would try and get you set up in a lab doing work over the summer because there was no classes for the summer months after first year of med school. So I was still interested in improving my resume, still interested in positive feedback, but all of a sudden I wasn't just like applying for a job at a lab. I could choose what I wanted to do from anything. Because at the time I didn't feel like I needed to continue old lines of thought, you know, I was just figuring things out. And so early on, I had an inkling that I was interested in neurosurgery, and I knew it's a very academic, science-forward field that also looks fondly on science and publications. So I was like, okay, well, I'm going to do something neuroscience-y. It could be relevant to neurosurgery. I also just think neuroscience is really cool. And I remembered lectures during first year of med school about patch clamping on single neurons in some of the early patch clamping experiments. And I have another video on patch clamping. It is really cool, right? You make these tiny glass tubes, you record from single cells, these like microscopic structures. You're literally putting like a tiny glass tube next to it and then listening to it discharge and doing measurements on, you know, the current running through the membrane. It's just, it sounded like, you know, science fiction, but it was actually science nonfiction. And I remember hearing these lectures and just being like, I think those would be really cool experiments to run, right? Independent of what I was doing an experiment on. It was not like, oh, I want to solve something in neuroscience that got me interested. It was like, that looks like a very cool technique, and that would be fun to do. So I looked up people who were doing single neuron recordings. I ended up getting paired with a great mentor and started kind of learning the basics of how the lab worked, how they did their models of epilepsy, and again, really supportive mentor who was very into like building up his lab and building up people in his lab. And I just had fun. I learned a little bit about doing single neuron recordings. But it wasn't like I was doing everything that first summer. I was basically working with people who had already been trained on these techniques, and they were showing me how they were doing them, and I was doing histology, but learning basics. So come later in med school, it's very common at the med school I went to take a research year between your third year of med school and your fourth year of med school. We call it the fifth year, but interestingly, it comes after third year. Funny wording. So there's this built-in thing where most people at the med school would take an extra year of research. It was actually the minority of folks at my school that at that time would graduate in 4 years because research was so well built in the system. They had like everything set up with like how to interact with mentors and how to get funding. And So it's kind of like built into it. So I was going into a competitive specialty. I decided I wanted to do neurosurgery. I had worked in a nice lab doing neuroscience. So I just decided, hey, I'm gonna keep working in the same lab, and I want to do some neuroscience. I want to do some of these experiments. I want to record from single neurons. And the first project I started doing was working with a postdoc, and we were, I don't want to go into the details of science, I want to keep this about the story. Basically, we were doing some complicated experiments, they weren't working great. And so a couple months, like 3 months into my research year, I had to sit down with my mentor and we talked about whether I should switch projects entirely. And it was risky, but he proposed this other thing, which involved doing these patch clamping on neurons. It was kind of, the technique he proposed was something we hadn't done in the lab before, and it was totally risky, and it felt like, you know, a dangerous move to kind of like switch projects midstream, but it also sounded kind of cool. And so I started working on this whole new project where I had zero experience in. I had to build this whole big machine in order to do neuron recordings. I had to find text to read about what tools you need, and I had to like purchase all the instruments necessary to do these whole cell recordings. And that was, I mean, an education in itself, like building this thing from scratch. Because I built this table and got the software and did the recording thing and made it so that I could record from neurons in this whole cell technique, and actually in a rodent model of epilepsy. And it was just so incredibly satisfying getting that to work, right? I'm not talking about publications, I'm not talking about figures and stuff, but building an ePhys rig and getting your first neuron recordings that is purely the product of you putting together this puzzle was just a satisfaction that I had not had in a long time. It felt like winning, and it just made you feel good and powerful. Like, wow, I created this data. It wasn't like someone else doing it. Like, I really did this, and it was just a very cool feeling. I remember jumping up and down with my mentor when I started getting these first couple recordings, and it was just so much fun. And that, you know, that project really set the stage for everything else that came after that. And I'm gonna pause there because it's already getting to be kind of a long video. So I'm like approaching the end of med school, about to apply to neurosurgery residency, and have kind of just gotten some stuff to work. So more to come.